The man in the brown jacket hit her so hard, her coffee flew across the table. Ruth Calloway was 74 years old, sitting alone in a booth at Maple Lane Diner in Ridgemont, Ontario, eating a bowl of tomato soup on a Tuesday morning. That was all she was doing, eating soup. And then Bryce Holt put his hand flat against the side of her face and shoved her into the window. She didn't fall. The window stopped her, but her head hit the glass, and the sound of it went through the diner like a gunshot. Nobody moved. Bryce straightened his jacket. He picked up the folder that had slid off the table, the one with the offer letter inside, the one Ruth had refused to sign for the 4th time, and he tucked it under his arm. He looked down at her the way a man looks at something he stepped on. "Next Tuesday," he said. "You sign, or you deal with what comes after." He walked out. The door swung shut behind him. The diner went back to the sound of the coffee machine. Ruth pressed her hand to her temple. Her fingers were shaking. There are moments that define a town, not the ribbon cuttings or the hockey championships or the Canada Day parades. The moments that define a town are the ones where everyone looks away at exactly the wrong time. Ridgemont had looked away for 2 years. It had started small, the way these things always do. Lakefront Holdings had come in with renderings and promises, and a development plan for 22 acres along the eastern shore of Lake Algonac. A resort complex, the kind that brings tax revenue and construction jobs, and always, the kind of people who have no use for the ones who were already there. The land they needed ran through 7 properties. 6 of them had sold within 18 months, some willingly, some after long silences and longer conversations with lawyers, who, it turned out, were on retainer with Lakefront Holdings. The 7th was Ruth Calloway's property, 2.5 acres of lakefront, with a farmhouse she'd lived in for 41 years, a workshop her late husband Gordon had built by hand, and a garden she kept up even now, even at 74, because Gordon had loved tomatoes in August. She wasn't selling. Bryce Holt was the man Lakefront Holdings sent when the lawyers stopped working. He had the build of someone who had played junior hockey and never quite let it go, and the confidence of a man who had never once faced a consequence. He drove a black F-350, and he knew the right people at the Ridgemont Town Hall, including Deputy Mayor Len Garfield, who had waved through the zoning amendments that made the whole project possible. What Bryce did not know, on that Tuesday morning in October, was that a man had pulled into the parking lot of Maple Lane Diner 2 minutes before he walked out of it. The man's name was Nathan Brooke. He was 38 years old. He drove a 2019 Ford Ranger with a cracked rear bumper and the kind of road dust that said he'd come a long way. He was on leave from CFB Esquimalt, where he was a petty officer first class with JTF-2. Canada's Special Operations Unit, the quietest and most capable fighting force the country had. He'd been in for 15 years. He didn't talk about it. He came home to see his mother. Beside him in the truck, in the back seat, was a Belgian Malinois named Scout. Scout was 7 years old, ex-military working dog, retired from active deployment after an IED incident outside Kandahar. She had a small scar above her left eye. She was the calmest animal Nathan had ever known, and the most dangerous. Nathan parked. He looked through the diner window. He saw a man in a brown jacket walking away from his mother's booth. He saw his mother's hand go to her head. He sat for 3 seconds. Then he got out of the truck. He didn't run. He never ran when it wasn't necessary. He walked across the gravel lot with Scout at his left heel, pushed open the diner door, and the little bell above it rang. The whole diner looked up. Bryce was near the register, pulling out his wallet to pay for a coffee he'd ordered but never touched. He turned when the bell rang, the way everyone did. Nathan walked past him without looking at him. He went straight to his mother's booth. He sat down across from her, reached across the table, and took her hand. "Mom." She looked at him, her eyes filled. "Nathan." Her voice was barely a sound. "You weren't supposed to be here until Thursday." I drove faster. He turned her hand over, looked at the red mark on her wrist where she'd braced against the table. Then he looked at her temple. Did he hit you? She started to say it was nothing. Ruth. He said her name the way he said everything. Quiet, without weight or judgment, just precise. Did that man hit you? She closed her eyes. He pushed me, into the window. Nathan set her hand down carefully. He turned in the booth. Bryce was still at the register. He had been watching the exchange, with the expression of a man recalibrating. The stranger was big, not tall exactly, but the kind of compact, load-bearing big that comes from 15 years of carrying weight under pressure. And the dog sitting at his heel was not a pet. Bryce had been in enough rooms to read when a situation had changed. He decided to establish himself first. "Something I can help you with?" He said it to Nathan's back, loud enough for the room. Nathan stood. He turned around. Scout stood with him. She didn't growl. She didn't need to. She simply fixed her amber eyes on Bryce and became very still. And something in that stillness crossed a line in Bryce's brain he hadn't known was there. "You put your hands on my mother," Nathan said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of a fact that had been established and was now being acknowledged. Bryce shifted his weight. "I don't know what she told you, buddy, but she and I were just having a conversation. There are 11 people in this diner," Nathan said. "Every one of them saw it." Bryce glanced around. The 11 people looked away. That was the thing about Ridgemont. It had been looking away for 2 years. Bryce had counted on that. "I suggest you go back to wherever you came from and let the adults. I'm going to need you to stay where you are," Nathan said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not loud, not angry, just final. The way you say a thing when it is simply true and does not need amplifying. That stopped Bryce mid-step. From a table near the window, a man set down his fork. His name was Gary Willett. He was the Ridgemont town constable, one of 2, and he had been eating eggs and reading the Ridgemont Recorder when all of this started. He was 56 years old. He had a face that had made all its hard decisions a long time ago, and now mostly just wanted to get to retirement without incident. He and Bryce weren't friends exactly, but Gary understood the architecture of the town. He understood who Bryce was connected to. He had been watching the whole thing with the careful eyes of a man deciding how much trouble this was going to cost him. He stood up slowly, adjusted his duty belt, walked over. "All right," Gary said. "Let's everybody take a breath." Nathan looked at him. "My mother was physically assaulted. I'd like a report filed. Now I understand there's some. She hit the window. There's a mark on her temple. There are 11 witnesses." Nathan paused. "Are you going to file the report?" Gary looked at Bryce. It was a small look, very quick. But Nathan caught it. A university woman in the corner booth, a university student from Sudbury named Priya Mehta, who was up in Ridgemont for reading week and had been filming on her phone since the moment the tall man with the dog walked in. She kept filming. Gary cleared his throat. "Why don't we all step outside and—" "I'm not stepping outside," Ruth said, from her booth. Everyone looked at her. She was sitting very straight now. She had her hands flat on the table and her soup had gone cold. And she was looking at Gary with the particular expression of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and has recently used the last of it. "I've lived in Ridgemont for 41 years, Gary Willett. You coached Pee-wee hockey with my Gordon. You know exactly what's been happening with my property. You know exactly who this man works for." She looked at Bryce, and then back at Gary. "And now you know what he did in this diner, in front of 11 people. On a Tuesday morning," she folded her hands. "So, are you going to do your job?" The diner was so quiet they could hear the highway through the walls. Gary looked at his eggs. Then he looked at Bryce. Then he picked up his radio. There are moments when the only thing a man can do is choose which side of the line he's standing on. Gary had been standing in the middle of that line for 2 years. He stepped off it now, slowly, like a man stepping off a dock into cold water. He reported the assault. Bryce was not arrested that morning. He was taken in for questioning, and by afternoon his lawyer, a sharp man from Toronto, who had been on Lakefront Holdings payroll for 4 years, had him back in his truck. But the report existed. It was filed. It was on record, and Priya Mehta had already posted her video. She hadn't planned to. She'd come to Ridgemont to hike and get away from her screens, and she'd stopped at Maple Lane for coffee, and now she was sitting in her car in the parking lot watching the view counter climb. She'd titled it simply, "Man Attacks Elderly Woman at Diner." Son just walked in. Within the first hour it had 80,000 views. By evening it was on CBC News at 6. By midnight, the comments had done what comments do. They found Bryce Holt. They found Lakefront Holdings. They found the name of the company's chief acquisition officer, a man named Terrence Voss, based in Calgary. And they found the name of Ridgemont's deputy mayor, Len Garfield, who had approved 3 separate zoning variances for the project in 14 months, all while his wife's brother-in-law worked as a project manager for Lakefront's Ontario division. The thread connecting those dots was thin, but it was there, and once enough people started pulling it, it held. Nathan sat with his mother that evening in the kitchen of the farmhouse. He made tea. Ruth wrapped her hands around the mug and looked out at the lake going gray in the October dusk. "They're going to come back," she said. "A video doesn't change what they want." "No," Nathan said. "It doesn't." He set his own mug down. He pulled out a phone, not the ordinary one, the one he used for personal calls. The other one, ruggedized casing, encrypted OS, a contacts list that most people would not have access to. He scrolled to a name. The call was answered on the second ring. "Brooke," said the voice on the other end. "Thought you were on leave." "I am," Nathan said. "But I need a favor. Civilian matter. Possible fraud and coercion involving a federally regulated development project and a municipal official." He paused. "I'd like to know who to call." He listened. "RCMP Commercial Crime Section," the voice said. "And if the zoning's tied to federal land approvals, you want the Integrity Commissioner's office." "Thank you. Your mother okay?" "She will be." He ended the call, looked out the window. Scout was on the porch, watching something move in the tree line. A deer, probably. Her ears tracked it without urgency. Nathan spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table. He worked through everything Ruth had. The letters, the offers, the legal correspondence, the timeline of when each of her neighbors had sold. He built a picture. It was the same kind of picture he'd built in other places, under other circumstances, in darker rooms than this one. The mechanics of coercion were the same everywhere. Pressure, isolation, manufactured helplessness. Take away a person's belief that anyone is coming to help them, and eventually they sign whatever you put in front of them. Ruth had not signed. He sent everything to 3 addresses: the RCMP Commercial Crime Unit in Sudbury, the Ontario Integrity Commissioner's office in Toronto, and a journalist at the Globe and Mail who had covered a similar land acquisition case in New Brunswick 2 years earlier and had a reputation for reading her emails. Then he went to bed. He was asleep in 4 minutes. It was a skill. In Calgary, Terrence Voss saw the video at 11:30 that night. He was a careful man by nature, careful the way all people are careful who have built things they cannot afford to lose. He watched the clip twice: the dog, the quiet man, the constable filing the report on camera. Bryce's voice on the audio saying, "Let the adults," loudly enough for the whole room to hear. He called Bryce. "What were you thinking?" he said, and his voice had the flatness of a man who had moved well past anger into arithmetic. "It was nothing," Bryce said. "One old woman. I barely touched her." "You barely touched her in front of a girl with a phone," Voss said. "And now we're trending." He hung up. Sat in the dark for a while. Thought about the file he'd sent to Len Garfield 6 weeks ago, the one that wasn't supposed to exist, the one that laid out exactly what Lakefront Holdings expected in exchange for the consulting contract Len's brother-in-law had been given. He thought about where that file was. Then he called his own lawyer. 2 days later, a woman came to Ruth's door. Her name was Sandra Garfield. She was 51 years old, and she had been married to Len Garfield for 23 years. And she had spent 22 of them knowing, in the particular way that partners know things, what kind of man she had married. She had a folder under her arm. She had driven herself, which she almost never did anymore because her hands sometimes shook when she drove and they were shaking now. Ruth opened the door. Sandra looked at her. She looked at the mark still faintly visible on Ruth's temple, already yellowing to a bruise. "I need to show you something," she said. They sat at Ruth's kitchen table. Nathan stood near the counter. Scout lay on the floor by the back door, head on her paws, watching Sandra with calm attention. Sandra opened the folder. She laid out 11 pages. She walked through them without looking up. What the pages contained was the consulting contract, the email chain between Voss and Len, 3 wire transfers, a memo from Lakefront Holdings' legal team that referenced political facilitation in language clinical. Enough to sound innocent to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, and clear enough to anyone who did. She had taken them from Len's filing cabinet 2 nights ago. She had been thinking about it for longer than that. "He doesn't know. I have these," she said. Ruth looked at the papers. Then "Why are you doing this?" Sandra was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the birch trees. The lake made the low sound it makes in October, heavier than summer. "Because I saw the video," Sandra said. "And I kept thinking about what you looked like when your head hit that window." She looked up. "And because I've been looking the other way for a very long time and I'm tired." Nathan took photographs of every page. He forwarded them within the hour. The RCMP arrived in Ridgemont the following Monday. Not in force. 2 investigators, plain clothes, driving an unmarked Jeep. They met with Nathan at the farmhouse, spent 3 hours with Ruth's documents and the photographs of Sandra's papers, and left with a case file. Len Garfield was placed on administrative leave by the municipality pending investigation that Wednesday. Terrence Voss was named in a parallel complaint filed by the Integrity Commissioner's office the same afternoon. His assistant, it turned out, had kept records of a great many things that Voss had assumed were not being recorded. Bryce Holt was charged with common assault on Thursday. His lawyer argued it was a minor incident. The video had 400,000 views by then. The judge set a trial date. That evening, Nathan sat on the porch with his mother. The temperature had dropped and the lake was silver in the early dark. Scout was lying across Ruth's feet, which she had started doing around the second day, and Ruth had stopped pretending she didn't like it. "What happens to my property?" Ruth asked. "The project can't proceed without the zoning variances," Nathan said. "Without Len, those get reviewed. If the fraud charges stick, there's a reasonable case for reversal." Ruth was quiet. "Your neighbors," Nathan said, "the ones who sold. There may be grounds for them too, depending on what the investigators find. How the pressure was applied. Whether the offers were made in good faith or in a context of manufactured coercion." "Manufactured coercion," Ruth repeated. "Is that what it's called?" "It's one of the things it's called." She was quiet again for a while. A loon called somewhere out on the lake. In October, Nathan always forgot how loud they were. "Gordon would have liked you," Ruth said. "He always liked people who were precise." Nathan looked at her. "He was your father," he said. "He was precise." Ruth smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since he'd arrived. He was. He just wasn't very good at showing it. She reached down and scratched behind Scout's ears. "You got that from him too, you know." Scout leaned into her hand. 3 weeks later, the municipality of Ridgemont issued a formal statement, suspending all active zoning approvals related to the Lakefront Holdings development pending the outcome of the RCMP investigation. 4 families who had sold their properties along the Lake Algonac shoreline filed a civil action against Lakefront Holdings, alleging coercive practices during the acquisition process. A Ridgemont law firm agreed to represent them on a contingency basis. Bryce Holt pleaded guilty to common assault in December. He was fined and placed on a conditional discharge. His name, by then, was attached to enough public record that Lakefront Holdings terminated his contract quietly, without severance, in a letter so short it barely counted as a letter. Terrence Voss resigned from his position at Lakefront Holdings in November. He issued a statement about wanting to spend more time with his family. Nobody who had been following the story found this surprising. Len Garfield did not resign. He waited until the charges were formally laid in January, and then he resigned, and then he hired a different lawyer. Sandra Garfield moved to her sister's place in Hamilton. She'd been thinking about doing that for a while too. Nathan left Ridgemont on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after he'd arrived. His leave was up. He had a truck to drive, and a dog to feed, and a base to get back to. And the particular discipline of a man who does not linger when the work is done. Ruth stood in the driveway. The leaves were all the way down now. The birch trees were bare and white and clean against the gray sky. "You don't have to go yet," she said. "I know," he hugged her. She held on a little longer than usual, and he let her. Scout sat beside him and looked at Ruth with her amber eyes, and Ruth crouched down, slowly, and put her forehead against Scout's head for a moment. Scout didn't move. Nathan got in the truck. He drove east out of Ridgemont, along the highway that ran beside the lake. The water was dark and wide and very still. In another month it would be frozen. He didn't look back. That wasn't the kind of man he was. But he drove a little slower than usual, just for a few minutes. Some towns get one chance to decide what they are. Ridgemont had been waiting 2 years for someone to make that decision easy in the end. It wasn't a Navy SEAL who made it. It wasn't a journalist or an investigator or a woman with documents in a folder. It was 11 people in a diner who were tired of looking away. It was a constable who finally picked up his radio. It was a woman named Sandra who drove herself somewhere, hands shaking, and knocked on a door. What Nathan gave Ridgemont wasn't justice. Justice takes longer than 3 weeks and is never as clean as anyone wants it to be. What he gave them was a reason to start. The narrator does not know how the trial will end. The narrator does not know if the families will get their land back, or something close to it, or something they can live with. The narrator does not know what happens to Ridgemont in 5 years, or 10, whether the resort gets built somewhere else or not at all, whether the town hardens or softens from all of this. But the narrator knows this. Ruth Calloway ate her soup the next Tuesday morning at Maple Lane Diner, at the same booth by the window, and nobody bothered her, and the coffee was hot. And Scout sat under the table with her head on Ruth's feet, and Ruth looked out at the main street of a town that had finally, slowly, after a long time, remembered how to look back.